we've been obsessed with these old moral tools. And so the move is to say, let's broaden our moral toolbox. If you have as a goal becoming a leader, I think one of the things that you should really think about in a world like ours is that part of what you're trying to do is accumulate the sort of influence that comes with significant responsibility, because your actions now no longer represent you as a private individual. Leadership is a very serious moral calling. One of the things that we don't talk about enough in climate policy is how much we overshoot and for how long really matters. Climate change isn't binary. It's not that either we hit dangerous climate change or we don't. How dangerous it is really, really matters. Just because you can't do everything, that doesn't mean you can't do something.
How can we live an ethical life in a seemingly catastrophic world? With climate change advancing and humanitarian abuses continuing unchecked, many of us are left feeling helpless with this sense that the problems of today are simply too big to address on our own. For the latest episode of the Values and Interests podcast, I'm happy to be joined by moral philosopher Travis Rieder. As an associate research professor at Johns Hopkins University, Travis works to analyze and address some of the most challenging moral questions in our political and cultural environments. He's also the author of one of my favorite books of the past few years, Catastrophe Ethics: How to Choose Well in a World of Tough Choices. We cover a range of topics from the importance of embracing moral leadership to really practical ways of dealing with this pull of nihilism that many of us are feeling in our own lives today. I hope you find this conversation as enlightening and helpful as I did, and as always, be sure to subscribe to Carnegie Council. Travis, thanks so much for being here. It's always great to get the moral philosophers in front of us at Carnegie Council.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me, and thanks for your nice words about the book. I appreciate that.
Great. So before we jump into the wider conversation around kind of the ethical toolkit in kind of living your daily life, I wanted to give our listeners a sense of your own value system. And I always like asking the moral philosophers the question of how did you choose to make your life about moral philosophy, and kind of what were these light bulb moments where you said, okay, this is not only informing my personal path, but my professional path as well.
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. So I think when you ask a lot of people that sort of just folks in general, a lot of folks will reference like religion or spirituality as a place that they get morality and values from. And I was pretty young when I left the church that I was raised in,
Hmm.
and I didn't have that anymore. And I was drawn to philosophy as soon as I discovered it was a thing, as got to college and took philosophy courses. And so I really see much of my young adulthood as sort of searching for a value system, something to grab onto, because I was always convinced that even though I left spirituality or something, that didn't mean that, anything goes, right?
Yeah.
Without God, all is
Yeah.
permitted. Um, and so when I went to philosophy, I found that philosophers who are interested in ethics very often play this game where they decide for themselves on a system of values. And because philosophers love great monolithic structures, they sort of spend a career or a lifetime building up their own preferred monolithic structure, and that's their value system, and they just go around and apply it to
Yeah.
every problem they find. And so I was drawn to that because that's what philosophers do. And when I went to graduate school, I was really fortunate to go to Georgetown University, which has this very cool philosophy department. Um, I would say the philosophy department there is very pluralistic, where they let in a lot of different voices. Uh, Also, just exceptionally kind and nuanced in its thinking. And my faculty there taught me just through practice that anything that's worth thinking hard about in ethics is genuinely difficult, right? When you when you hang out with philosophers, they so often make it sound like once you've figured out the great monolithic structure that is true, all the other problems are simple. You just go around, you're like, well, world hunger is solved this way, climate change
Yeah.
is solved this way, abortion is solved this way, and there's nothing hard. And it all strikes me as hard. Like if it's a
Yeah.
question that people struggle with, it's because there's something genuinely interesting and difficult there.
Yeah.
So that's a long, rambly philosophical way of saying that my value structure is deeply pluralistic
Mm.
and is committed to there being a lot of insights from all different perspectives, many of which I won't come up with on my own.
Yep.
And so it's a lot about engaging and interpersonal dialogue. It's, if you're thinking about it in terms of politics, it's very democratic. You have to live with other people and get along with them. But even taking politics out of it, it's about you build a community, and the way you respect other people is by engaging them in good faith. So that's sort
Yep.
of where I start.
Great. No, you hit some key terms and notes there that are, central to us at the council as well in terms of good faith and a pluralistic approach. And, I think about when we are kind of building communities here at Carnegie Council, there's a huge appetite for an array of political views, an array of values, if you're playing within the pluralistic sandbox, right? And that is a delineation line for me in terms of good faith and bad faith, right? So if you're trying to blow up the sandbox, but you want to enter the discussion to do so, or you're trying to knock it down from the outside, and, I recently had a conversation with Simon Longstaff, who's a moral philosopher, leads the Ethics Center in Australia. And he talked about kind of, the difference between performative good faith and actual good faith. And, that definitely has informed my thinking in terms of how do you actually create civic spaces to have discussions and the difference between performative good faith and actual good faith. It's pretty clear, it's pretty obvious the binary between good and bad faith, but it's the middle ground when it comes to, I think, ethics as a tool to kind of to work through that.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I don't know if you intend for this to come up at all later in the conversation, but this seems to have gotten so much harder in my lifetime, in my
Yeah,
adult time.
yeah, yeah,
And surely social media has something to do with it. Surely the internet has something to do with it. But man, we are in love with our teams, right?
yeah,
You sign on to a team and now you know
yeah,
what the party line is and you better stick to it or you get shunned.
yeah,
Man, that is a recipe for just really terrible thinking. Uh,
yeah,
so that's a
yeah,
lot what I struggle with right now is that, you know, I imagine there are a variety of teams that would claim me based on some of the things that I believe. But if we get into conversation, I'm probably not going to agree with everything they say. And
yeah,
if they're dismissive of their interlocutors and opponents, I might say, hey, slow down.
yeah,
This group over here has something to take really seriously. So, yeah, it's
yeah.
gotten harder for sure.
Yeah, I think, and I'll pivot to this next question around kind of the moral toolkits that people possess right now and whether they're fit for purpose for this moment, right? And so I wanted to get that's posing a question there, but also kind of a reaction to, again, I'm going to go back to the recent interview with Simon. He talks about this conflation of concepts, right? So, like, just because you have a set of values and principles, you can think you're living a moral life, but are you living an ethical life, right? The other part of the equation there is that you constantly have to challenge your values, and your values inform your interests, and this interconnected cycle. So there is a difference between the ethical, reflective life and a moral life, to an extent. But I want to get your reaction to that statement, and then possibly bridging onto, the moral toolkits that are available today for this quite complicated zero sum politicized world that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, those definitely feel related to me. I think that a lot of us who spend our time thinking about ethics, whether it's because we're professional moral philosophers or committed to civic engagement or just, really want to be a good person, um, we're kind of desperate for rules, right? Like, man, rules have great pedigree. You get decalogues everywhere, right? Like these 10 thou shalt nots, and you're good to go.
Yeah.
Um, and I just can't imagine. I have a really hard time getting in the headspace where I think you follow some relatively short set of rules and then your moral job is done,
Yeah.
right? Um, it's perfectly possible to never kill anyone, never lie to anyone, steal anything, and
Yeah.
just be a total jerk,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that a lot of the interesting ethical stuff of life is much harder than are you violating some strict duty,
Yep.
right? Those are important. Boy, it's really important that we figure out whether or not you're ever allowed to steal,
Yeah.
right? Like for sure important, but it's just not where the job
Yeah.
ends. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no, at the council, we're translating this into the international relations world. We think about it as, kind of norms and laws. But it's in like we always try to make the distinction, right? That is the floor,
Yeah.
right? Like that is, yeah, it is the floor of which society has decided to build itself around. But moral, there's a higher moral responsibility when it comes to the individual living within that society. I know you touch on that in the book a bit. And I actually wanted to pivot to an anecdote early in the book in terms of your time at Hanover, when you're kind of describing your first foray into this climate and ethics world. And one of the things that hit me was this example of recycling that you talked about, in that, you know, at first glance, it feels right. It feels righteous. It feels virtuous. It almost feels obvious, right? And there's this community of obvious virtue that starts to kind of cycle around this concept of recycling. And I think you can fill in the blank with a bunch of other things throughout your life. But maybe kind of talk through that scenario that you described in the book for our listeners, because I think there's a really necessary moral epiphany kind of at the end of it.
It is funny because, I mean, for me, it's hard to admit, but college was 20 years ago. And yeah, I don't have so many like brightly remembered intellectual moments, but this one sticks out. And so it was when I was researching for the book that I remembered this and thought, oh man, I've been thinking about this for that long. But
Yep.
yeah, so I was walking across campus through this sort of thoroughfare, and a lot of us had just walked out of probably a moral philosophy class with one of my mentors. I think we were walking out of existentialism, but somehow we got on the topic of climate change, climate mitigation stuff. And a lot of my friends were people who I really admired, but who I would never be. And that is because they were like hippies. Uh,
Yeah.
I think the way I describe them in the book is, sort of proudly raggedy, would never buy new clothes,
Yeah.
don't shower very often, and like really committed to this minimalist impact on the environment lifestyle. And I cared about those things, but I was just not that way. So we were having this conversation and we were talking about recycling, and I did recycle, and I do recycle despite all of the weird stuff about it. But I was bothered by the sort of like trenchant moralism of like what kind of jerk wouldn't recycle.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I sort of timidly asked, I get it. Don't hate me. But also, I mean, I could recycle my whole life and the world wouldn't notice, right?
Yeah.
It wouldn't make an impact. Um, there wouldn't be any straight line drawn from a harm to my change in behavior. And I just remember feeling so self-conscious as they all just kind of stopped and looked at me. Like, why are you,
I can
why
imagine this. I can imagine the stares.
just like, why would you play devil's advocate? But I wasn't. I was genuine because it bothered me. Um, and then this professor, who I actually do remember who it was, but I don't name in the book, she comes and she's been sort of listening. And this is a small liberal arts college where professors and students are very close and spend a lot of time together. So she kind of like listening and she was noticing the pause. And then she sidled up beside me and linked arms with me and linked arms with the person next to me and said, well, but it's not just you. Now there are two of us. And it was this really elegant move that everybody was like, phew, thank God we solved that. And I laughed and they laughed, and then the conversation moved on. And then I thought to myself, that doesn't solve anything.
Yeah.
That doesn't answer my question.
Yeah.
But I stopped asking about it, at
Yeah.
least for then.
No, I mean it's a great example of what you talked about before in terms of, wanting an answer, right? But ethics actually just supplies another question, right? It unlocks the constant questioning in life. We at the council we think about this kind of in three-dimensional ethics in terms of ends, means, and consequences when you're thinking about the foreign policy world. And that's great, but once you get to a reflective point, it just starts the cycle again. Right. And then that's the burden for how we think about applied ethics here, especially if you're in a leadership position, especially if you're in a position of power, understanding that, the dynamic you talk about in the book in terms of individualism versus this institutional responsibility. But as a leader, as a political leader, as anything, as a teacher, right, you have this influence outside yourself. And so before we get into the climate side, I maybe wanted to touch on the leadership aspect of it. So you cover this in the book, and from I guess through the council's perspective around the principle of democracy and pluralism, right? There's a spectrum when it comes to leadership, right? There's a real tension when it comes to pluralism in terms of the negative consequences of bad leadership, but there's also huge upside in terms of moral leadership, right? And what that can do from a transformative perspective. And so you talk about, Joe Manchin casting this vote to put the climate legislation, put the act through that, is the biggest piece of climate legislation. This was back in 21, 22, around there, 22.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
early Biden's term, yeah.
and from an IR perspective, we think about, an example is President Truman, right? He has this basic blank check during the Korean War, militarily, politically, to use nuclear weapons when we are losing in Korea. But he makes a moral decision not to do this because he doesn't want to see more dead children. And so that's not insignificant. That's millions of people who are alive and millions of people have great, like, this is not some ethics isn't something that sits on the side and is just performative. So I wanted to maybe get into the leadership aspect and kind of the tension around that when we think about both living an ethical life and looking to people to be mentors or be moral guides for us, and kind of how the leadership dynamic should interact with our personal daily life there.
Yeah, I love this question because leadership comes in lots of forms, right? And so in politics, it can be real obvious because you have senators casting tie-breaking votes and standing up as moral exemplars, hopefully, ideally. You have presidents and governors with executive power making decisions. So you have Truman in your case. Um, but also you can have leadership of a pretty similar sort
Mm,
by being a celebrity, right?
yeah.
So what's interesting about our world now is that you can carry truly massive influence
Mm,
without being in elected office or
yeah.
something like that. So one of the examples I think about a lot is this might be because I have an 11-year-old, but I think about like pop stars. So
Mm,
especially like the very highest tier, so Taylor
yeah. Yeah.
Swift or Beyonce. Um, they have more power than many political leaders,
Yeah.
right? Um, and I actually really like the example of Taylor Swift because she's neither like fantastic exemplar nor, someone that I think you should just like use as a bad example because she actually takes her responsibility pretty seriously. So during in politics, right, she really wrestled with whether or not she should come out against Trump during the first term when a lot of her advisors were telling her, you don't do that, you're a pop star. That's not the sort of leader that you are. But then she also flies a private jet, all
Yeah.
around the world. Okay, so now we have this like broad array of leaders. And one of the things that I think about, I teach a class on catastrophe ethics for undergrads, and I teach at Johns Hopkins. A lot of these students fancy themselves being leaders of a form one day or another. And
Yeah.
one of the things that we talk about is that becoming a leader can be interpreted as sort of like scaling a ladder of
Mm.
influence and therefore responsibility.
Yep.
And so part of the tension that starts our conversation and that we'll probably continue talking about is that I'm just one person in a world of 8+ billion people, that's run by institutions, not just governments, but mass
Yep.
multinational corporations. I don't have any real power to influence.
Yep.
Um, but Bill Gates has power to influence, and Donald Trump has power to influence, and all sorts of elected officials have power to influence. Um, and you can scale that level. And so my comment in the book about Joe Manchin is when he cast the tie-breaking vote for the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, yes, he was an individual, but he wasn't the sort of individual where we say, like, you don't have power over the future or real impact.
Yeah.
He was more like an institution. Joe Manchin
Yeah.
casting that vote had more like the power of an entire government behind
Yep.
it.
Yep.
And so if you have as a goal becoming a leader, I think one of the things that you should really think about in a world like ours is that part of what you're trying to do is accumulate the sort of influence
Mm.
that comes with significant responsibility because
Yep.
your actions now no longer represent you as a private individual. They represent an institution or institutions or many thousands or millions or even billions of people.
Yep.
Yeah, so leadership is a very serious moral calling, I think.
One of the things we think about a lot here is the kind of the disconnect on the incentive structure of leading right now. So if you are not financially rewarded, or you're not rewarded with some prestige or celebrity, but at the same time you are being asked to take on this burden of leadership in an arena right now that is a big microscope, right? And so it's the willingness to understand that the return on investment is not kind of personal glorification or money, right there. There's a select group of people who are willing to do that. And we see this playing out in politics a lot where, you know, everything political leadership does not have to be a political calculation, right? You make that choice. Sometimes you have to lead from a position of moral clarity, right? And you have to bring people along with you. And I think our president at the council, Joe Rosenthal, he talks about this a lot in terms of there seems to be a widening gap between that from an action standpoint and also an understanding of that from a leadership standpoint in American politics.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, the incentive structure is maybe the biggest problem for
Yeah.
leadership, right? So if you take just US political context, the fact that so many decisions are driven by short-term electoral
Yep.
politics, like I have to get elected in 2 years or 4 years or 6 years,
Yep.
basically means that if that's a driving consideration, we're not going to solve generational problems like climate change. Like,
Yep.
how many people, I'm like trying to think off the top of my head, how many of them really seem to have like an ideology that they would lose an election for, that they would take a chance on losing an election for. And on both sides of the aisle, I can think of a few, uh,
Yeah.
but not that many.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
No.
and that's a real problem.
Yeah, and understanding the space to operate within, especially within an open society as a politician. So we think about this spectrum at the council between this naive idealism and amoral political realism, right? And from an open society perspective, it's not only operating within that spectrum, it's recognizing the trap of going too far to one side or the other. And of course, the trap of the naive idealism is that it might not produce what you want and you might be out of power. The other side is the amoral realism is that you eventually become the autocracy or the oligarchy you thought you were fighting against. And so, there's a lot, I'm sure all the listeners have seen me harp on this over and over again, but there's a lot of interesting kind of thinkers post World War II. But I also think that from an American context, I also think that to your point, Travis, that moral toolkit is getting a bit old, right? So like, what is the next version of that as the international system transitions? And I'm sure there'll be more conversations on this podcast about that in the future. So I wanted to pivot now to the climate side of things, which is really kind of what the book focuses on within this framework of moral responsibility. And so kind of in the early chapters of the book, you lay out these kind of four scenarios that the UN is laying out in the future. And we have this, I'm going to make a Dune reference here, in terms of the top tier, but this golden path for humanity in terms of everybody gets along and we mitigate climate threats and it's all good, right? And then we have kind of these bleaker scenarios, these three scenarios where we survive and we mitigate to an extent, but you go down the same way we went up the moral ladder before, the leadership ladder, we're going to go down here, where each tier, when it comes to warming, basically people who, didn't cause climate change, who benefited the least from the Industrial Revolution, suffer the most. Right. And so like I was hoping you could give kind of a snapshot and maybe talk through some of the nuances of those four scenarios, because that's the moral world that I'm going to be living in when I'm older. My son will be living in, right? So like what does that look like? I want to try to understand the environment that's coming for us.
Yeah, so a lot of what I spend my time doing when I'm thinking about climate ethics is really dark, but it's also not ethics. It's trying to understand what are our possible futures.
Yeah.
And the folks who work on this are computer modelers, and so they run scenarios. This is really fascinating because it's a very computationally expensive process,
Mm,
but it's also a moral process in some way.
mm,
So the folks who come up with scenarios, come up with futures. So scenario is actually the technical term where the computer modelers say, look, I can't predict the future. I can predict a future given that agents relevantly like us make certain decisions. So tell me which decisions they're going to make.
mm,
And so then we have to give them a bunch of things. So we say, well, something like the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Action Act passes and doesn't get rescinded a few years later. And then we scale up our mitigation efforts. This leads our international partners, especially China, to similarly sort of come to the table and work hard as well. This makes blocks like the EU even more committed, and we have this sort of mutually reinforcing model. Okay, great. So then they can plug those in as variables, see what happens. But then there are all the worst versions of that too, where actually we just become retrenchantly nationalist,
yeah. Yeah.
and and we make like very irrational choices to go back to like not very profitable fossil fuels,
Yeah.
but just because, I guess. So the green path, or as you say, the golden path, is the most optimistic scenario. I've literally never spoken to anyone who works in climate science, climate ethics, climate policy who thinks that this is possible. It's sort of technically possible, or at least it was when I wrote the book, when the model was published. So it's possible sort of according to the physics of the world,
Yeah.
but it's not practically possible.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what that world looks like is we do not limit warming to 1.5 degrees, which is this sort of goal that was laid out in the Paris Accords. We only barely overshoot it.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we don't talk about enough in climate policy is how much we overshoot and for how long
Yeah.
really matters. Because if we really start to draw down our emissions, then our atmospheric carbon concentration goes up, but then it starts to fall again. It peaks and it starts to come back down. And so warming lasts for a while and then we start to cool. So on the green pathway, we don't warm all that much more, maybe like 1.6, 1.7 degrees, but then it starts to come down. And that would just, it wouldn't be great. I mean, look at the world right now, right? We're
Yeah.
already kind of on fire, but it would just be so much better than the other possible futures, right? But it's not realistic. It requires just a rabid
Yeah.
obsession with decarbonization.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that jumped out to me in the early chapters too was this, which is from an applied ethics perspective too, like the want and the need for people to put stuff into binaries, right? Like we either have climate change or we don't, right? And you talk about the fact that, well, no, it's happening, and the literal degrees of separation here can mean millions and millions of people's lives, right? So there is there is a moral nuance and a human cost nuance that you really have to account for, but people don't want to from a contextual standpoint. They just want to say, I'm for it or against it, or we're either going to stop it or it's going to be here, and then whatever, we'll deal with it.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is one of my favorite things to say to people when they give me a sort of cynical response to either teaching or lecturing. Uh, so if they say, look, well, if it's not possible to avoid dangerous climate change,
Mm,
why
yeah,
not just eat, drink, and be merry, right? The
yeah,
world's going to burn. And the response is because climate change isn't binary. It's not that either we hit dangerous climate change or we don't.
yeah,
How dangerous it is really, really matters. So intuitively, we can show that because, every tenth of a degree is associated with more climate harms, especially the heat. We just don't talk about the heat enough. It's
yeah,
sort of like the other stuff is so violent that it
yeah,
captures our imagination, the hurricanes and the wildfires.
yeah.
But heat death is gonna be a huge part of our future, especially if you happen to be living in the Middle East or North Africa or the Mediterranean, right? Um, so yeah, so the harms go up significantly with every tenth of a degree. To illustrate this, I cite a study that since I didn't prepare to summarize this study, I'm not going to be able
It's
to give you
okay.
the exact details, but it's something like, you know, if we aim at one of the worst futures, the global average temperature rise is going to be close to 4 degrees, 3.7, 4.1, something like that. Um, and at that level, we're looking at like 81 million people dying just heat deaths,
Mm,
just from heat by the year 2100. That's the,
mm,
the scale that we're looking at. Um,
oh,
but if we could limit warming to not great, right? But to something
yeah, yeah.
approaching realistic. So like 2.4, 2.5 degrees, something like that. So something sort of on a par with where we're heading or where we were when I wrote the book. Um, then we could reduce those number of heat deaths to like 9 million or something. So again, don't quote me. The numbers are in the book. But it's something like you could save 60 to 70 million people from heat death by the end
Mm,
of the century by getting to not great instead of catastrophic,
yeah,
right? That's why this isn't binary.
yeah,
Every bit counts.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, this goes to directly in terms of what we're thinking about. College students will come here, or fellows will come here, and we'll talk to them about applied ethics, right? It's about making the most responsible choice, right? Like there is no clear-cut good or like sometimes there is a good or bad answer, like inherently, right, in the beginning of making the decision. But like we don't have this moral crystal ball, right? We can't see past our own choices, right? We have to own the consequences and then adjust. But this is a very literal example where like if you just don't even tackle the ethical question, people are going to die. And so it's a really because you get basically there's like two ends of the nihilism spectrum here. There's the I'm so committed to climate change and I don't think I can do anything and I fall into nihilism. And then there's almost this purposeful political nihilism where it's like, yeah, not important to me, right? And in terms of prioritization. So I know you talk about nihilism a bit also in the book, and our president at the council, Joel Rosenthal, wrote a piece on this in terms of moral resilience a few months back. But um, kind of keeping on the ethics focus here, I, could you pick apart kind of nihilism and its role in the current kind of I'd say climate catastrophe? If I'll steal from your book a little bit.
Yeah. So I got really interested in nihilism of a particular sort. And so sometimes we say, oh, so and so's a nihilist, and we just sort of mean they're a cynic or they're like
Yeah, yeah,
dark and mopey. Um, so I mean nihilism in this sort of technical sense that when confronted with these massive collective threats, so we're going to talk mostly about climate change, but I mean, all sorts of capitalistic infrastructure, right? The fact that we are this massive globally connected system. And so if you think that animal rights are important, then the situation with animals is an absolute catastrophe. Um, Also, human rights abuses in the supply chain, slave labor, right? That sort of thing. So I'm just an individual. These problems are massive on a global scale, involving networks and systems that I cannot possibly grasp. And the nihilist says the result of my evaluating that accurately, noting that I cannot make a real difference,
Mm,
means that there are no moral facts relevant to me. So
yeah.
the sort of jargony philosophy here is that a nihilist believes that there's nothing of something. And so the
Mm,
nihilist here says there aren't any moral facts that apply to me about climate change, about slave labor in the supply chain. You tell me that my favorite chocolate brand involves slave labor at the bottom of the supply chain. And I say, yeah, but I can't stop that, so I'm going to keep eating my chocolate.
yeah.
That's a form of nihilism that, like, I don't think it's a burden on me to boycott this company because my
Mm,
boycott doesn't matter. And
yeah,
that
yeah.
shows up in climate change. And the reason I got interested in this is because I work with young people, right? I teach college
Yeah,
students,
yeah.
and their nihilism is even a bit more sophisticated because
Mm,
one, they don't think they can make a difference, sort of accurately understanding the system. Two, they say that it's the system's responsibility, which is true. So multinational corporations, governments, it's their job. And three, therefore, it's not my job because they're putting it on me, is this sort of grotesque abdication of responsibility, saying, hey, 18-year-old who didn't choose any of this, it's your job to fix it. And so they're like multiply nihilists. They're like, one, there are no moral facts that apply to me.
yeah.
Also, like, are you kidding me? This is
Yeah,
just not my job. Like,
yeah, yeah.
clean up your own mess, old people.
Yeah, yeah. No, so I have a very like this is a lower scale, but very like it literally cost me money, right? So I was coming out of college during the financial crash. And you have your life laid out for you and you think you're going to get a job and then, boom, right? And so I remember feeling, for the years after, the 2012, 11, 12 when you're kind of like finally getting a job and I remember feeling this anger and this bitterness towards kind of the financial world. And I remember making like this very stupid decision where like my company was offering a 401k match and I said, "Well, why would I give money to the people who just blew up the system and ruined my life for 4 years?" Right? And so like I just waited. And like there's value in that emotion, but it doesn't take into account the context in terms of the way the world is working, right? And so like while I felt righteous in the moment, in the years I lost that compounding interest. So, it's interesting, I'm 36, so I feel like I'm on this island between I'm not young and I'm not old and I don't understand anybody. So that's a little anecdote from from my years right after college.
No, that sounds very familiar. And so then my students are sort of that on steroids, right?
Yeah.
Because they have grown up. I mean, this is a bit of an exaggeration, but they've really grown up with just catastrophe after catastrophe, right?
Yeah.
Because they were kids during the financial crisis,
Yeah.
and so their parents either weathered that or didn't.
Yeah.
And then they were quite young when COVID hit, and they've seen this just vicious seesawing our political system. And they're young enough that Donald Trump has always been on the scenes. And that's strange for me because the political world has changed so much since he showed up, right?
Yeah.
I grew up where it was like Clinton and Bush were the sort of figures of like, are you a progressive? Are you a conservative? Um, and it feels almost quaint now. Like we were very like strong in our opinions, and I thought Bush just made a whole mess of a bunch of stuff, which he did. But I also believed that I could sit down and have a good faith discussion with him or any of his followers.
Yeah.
And it could potentially even lead to progress. And yet
Yeah.
my students have grown up in a world where these catastrophes have happened one after the other. And I don't think they've ever seen that sort of good faith engagement from
Yeah.
leaders. It doesn't show up on the internet. It doesn't show
Yeah.
up on social media. It doesn't show up on the late night talk shows where they get their news, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think this goes back to as a child growing up in the 90s, this goes back to the similar experiences in terms of the point I made before, the pluralistic sandbox, right? The good faith sandbox. And to basically have an entire generation that has grown up where the other side is the enemy, or at least from an American context, right? And you're seeing the consequences of that now from a policy perspective, from a normative perspective in international relations, from an international law perspective in terms of what's happening right now. So I wanted to kind of go further into the climate change dynamic around kind of this personal responsibility versus institutional dynamic. And so you have this line in the book where it says that the big polluter's masterstroke was to blame the climate crisis on you and me. And if I could take kind of one line and summarize the entire book in terms of what it alludes to, it felt like that was it for me. And so I wanted to kind of tee you up with that to kind of maybe dig into it a bit.
Yeah, that was a quote. I think that was George Monbiot.
Yep.
Yeah.
And it was UNC, right? He wrote the article in terms of collective what was it? Something about responsibility. Am I getting that right? I have to look that up. But yeah,
Uh,
no, it's the quote from the book.
yeah. So, I've been talking about the book now for over a year, and so it's sort of morphed in my head
Yeah.
kind of what the punchline is. But I now think that so we think about nihilism as the core problem to be solved. And the reason I consider it a problem to be solved is that I don't think it's true. Um, so the nihilist says, because I can't make a difference, there are no moral facts that apply to me. So
Mm,
I can't make a difference in these big problems. So eat, drink, and be merry. I don't think it's true, and I don't think it's acceptable
yeah.
in our society. But I think the first half is true, which is that they can't make a difference in their individual private actions, that none of us who are sort of just tiny people can, right? So we're not casting the tie-breaking vote on an Inflation Reduction Act, so we're just you and I. And the puzzle then is if if you concede the empirical fact that my
Mm,
individual acts don't matter, why
mm,
doesn't the moral fact follow that I
mm.
should therefore be permitted to do anything? That's the puzzle, right?
Yep.
And the move is to say we've been obsessed with these old moral tools, right?
Yep.
Old moral tools are the only way you can generate something ethically worth talking about is if you can generate a strict duty that we can beat each other over the head with, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's wrong of you to punch me in the nose, just like it's wrong of you to commit murder, just like it's wrong of entire corporations and nation states to pollute. And those are the strict wrongs that we can then say, well, the nation states have a duty to clean up climate change in the same way
Mm,
that you have a duty not to punch me, but I can't have a duty to clean up climate change. And so the move is to say, let's broaden our moral toolbox because to start out the way that you did, if the ethical is bigger than just the sort of strictly moral, you can follow the rules and still be a jerk, right?
yep.
So, in the words of my mentor Maggie Little, a huge part of ethics is the sub-erogatory, right?
Mm,
So, erogatory is like the duty stuff.
yeah.
The stuff that's below that is really freaking important. It matters to us mightily whether or not the people around us are jerks, even if they follow all the rules, right? So, a big part of the puzzle is trying to think about what these tools could be. But there's this other component, which is that the systems and structures are actively doing wrong. So I don't want us to say that that's not true just because you and I can have some responsibility to bind together and to try to engage in collective action. That certainly doesn't mean that the US government right now is morally permitted to roll back environmental
Yeah.
policy. Like, no, it's an egregious wrong. It's a wrong that we should be honest will result in thousands, tens of thousands,
Yeah.
depending on how long it goes on, scales up, millions of lives being lost or severely harmed. Um, so it's an egregious wrong. And so, why doesn't their responsibility also kind of get us off the hook, right? So, why is it the case that I can still have responsibility when they're the ones who have real power? And so, this is sort of two sides of it that I think both need to be answered.
Mm,
Why is it possible for me to have responsibility given that I can't make a difference? And then why would we say that I have a responsibility given that the
mm,
real work should be done by governments, multinational corporations, that sort of thing?
yeah.
So I'm very concerned about the idea. This has gotten a lot of play recently,
Mm,
that as soon as you recognize that, the US and China as nation states, and then BP and Shell and a whole bunch of the top 100 companies are responsible for, just all of this harm that's coming through their emissions, that somehow gets us off the hook because the structures should then take it on.
yeah.
And what I think we need to be able to do is to think about what can and therefore should I do with my time, resources, etc. And some of that's going to involve recycling and composting and investing in energy efficient appliances and buying an electric car instead of a gas guzzler and installing solar panels if you can. Like this, what I call this purity stuff,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Trying to minimize my impact on the environment.
Yeah, there's a sense of irony, there's a sense of irony there, and the prescription for saying it's not your responsibility or it's out of your control is to give up more agency by not engaging, and
Yes,
that it's it's a big this scales to a lot of issues in the national security space where well I have nothing to do with that, right? But in a liberal open society where you are provided the freedom to at least create a community around a concern, to give that up seems to be antithetical to what you were trying to achieve at its core.
100%. I mean, I end the book because it's a bit of a dark read.
Yeah, no, yeah. But I will give you credit. You say that a bunch, so you prime the
Yeah.
audience.
So I try to end the book with why I think we should actually feel better about thinking this through.
Yeah,
Because I mean, writing the book, which was really just the culmination of, 10 to 20 years, depending on how you think about it, of like thinking this through and trying to work on it.
yeah,
Um, it's sort of like self-therapy
yeah,
because I do think giving up more agency as a response to this stolen agency is another catastrophe. It's catastrophic to my sense of meaning. It's catastrophic to my ability to feel like I matter morally in this world. And so I do, in fact, think that there's a sort of existential reason for trying to regain agency, for figuring out what it is that I can and should, in fact, do. Um, because it's salvaging meaning in a world that feels like it's kind of trying to strip it away
yeah,
from us.
yeah, yeah,
So we go back to that point of, so how do we respond to the people that say, well, this is Shell's problem and the US government's problem and not mine? Well, my question at the every day is, I have to get up and do something. And so if it feels like there are better and worse choices vis-a-vis my interactions with the environment, I want to know which ones are better and worse and why.
yeah,
And so some of the better actions I do think will be that purist stuff. I don't think you're obligated to try, to organize your life around trying to get solar panels because only if you get solar panels are you a decent person. That seems obviously false to me. Most people in America can't afford solar panels because that's our messed up economy. Um, so like that's not a requirement, but a whole bunch of people can't afford them, and I think it's good to invest in a
yeah,
technology that we need to invest in. But then there's other stuff. There's stuff where you try to build the structure that will force change at the systemic level. And so if you want to say that the problem is with our multinational corporations and our governments, et cetera, the systems of power, then one of the ways you can respond is to say, fine, I'm not going to worry so much about purity. I'm going to worry
yeah,
about trying to tear it down.
yeah,
And so you get involved and you build community and you phone bank for radical politicians. And that's what you spend your time and energy doing. And I think that is an equally good life.
yeah,
you could probably convince me that there's an argument that actually says for a lot of people it's a better life. But one of the arguments of the book is there's no one size fits all here.
Yeah, that's really important. I also think that, going back to the agency question, the ability to create community, like, you invest in a stock market when it's low, right? Not when it's high, right? Like in an attempt to what's happening right now politically in terms of fractured shared community, fractured shared understanding of values, right? Like if your issue is that you feel alone, you don't feel like you can have an impact, well, you have to start somewhere, right? So you can multiply that, right, by two, and then it can exponentially increase, right? If you put your agency into that. And I think in terms of creating kind of in-person, non-digital communities, that can have a domino effect in your personal life, in your professional life, in your mental health, in your physical health, like fill in the blank, like get a dog, walk the dog with other people, right? Like these is like basic 101 things that people, especially in this digital environment and this politically um, tense environment, I think it's to some extent it's the answers are right in front of us in terms of what our parents did, what we did growing up, and people don't want to look to that necessarily. I also wanted to make just something I've it's been coming up in conversations a lot with academics, in that talking about kind of the value of being able to like critically sit with something, not for a day, not for a week, but for like 5 years, right? And so I think that, when I speak to academics, they say that kind of off the cuff a little bit, but most people don't have the opportunity to do that. And so, like a few years ago, I went back and got my master's, and I was focused on kind of the theory of IR. And the best part about it was just not doing like the kinetic side of work and meetings every day, but like, I'm going to write this 10,000 word article, right? And like, I hadn't had that experience in over a decade, or had never really seriously had it because undergrad was a thing to get through, and now you're self-selecting into something to do. But I think that creating more spaces, and which I know is a luxury, I know it comes with a sense of privilege, but creating the spaces to just critically think about something, whether it's a hobby, whether it's writing an academic article, I think it's just an amazing thing to do. But not many people have the opportunity to do that. So how do we reckon with that?
It's an incredible privilege, 100%. It's one of the sort of great benefits of my life is that I get to have long long thinking sessions. Not like because I get to sit for a few hours a day, but yeah, because I get to
Yeah,
work on an idea for years. Um, I will say though, one of the things I've been most impressed with. So this is my second book, which you may or may not know, but my first book was very different. It was on pain and opioids and America's drug overdose crisis. And they're both trade books, right? Popular books rather than academic presses.
yep,
And one of the great benefits of doing that is that I talk to a lot of readers.
yeah,
And what I mean by that is not just people who have read my book, but the sort of people who read my nerdy books are active readers. They read a lot, you know.
yeah, yeah.
I feel because I have to read so much, very often boring stuff for my job. I feel very good if I read 5 or 10 books in a year, sort of like
Yeah, yeah,
pleasure, intellectually stimulating stuff. Well, I talk to a lot of people who read like 20, 30, 50 books a year. Like what they do at night is they sit down and read a few chapters of a book and they just do that all the time. I will say that although I think that one of the great privileges of my life is that I get to think and create by writing, the folks who read a lot, they sit with ideas for a
yeah,
long time. Um,
yeah,
it's really impressive because they will have read, dozens of books on politics. And yeah, I've like studied political philosophy for a while, but
yeah,
they've read so many different perspectives on, what's happening in Russia and like how to understand that from
yeah,
the historical perspective and what it means for today. And you do get to sit with those ideas and they stew and they reveal interesting things about the world.
yeah, yeah,
So
yeah,
I think a lot of people could do this and it's like one of my missions to like
yeah.
get more people to read and just think about cool stuff.
Yeah. And then empirically, it's very hard to measure. So my own research focuses on narratives. And so, you think about the parallel to reading a book or receiving a message from some, from a place. But the thing that's been most convincing to me in the literature from a psychology perspective is when people feel confident enough to socialize what they've learned, right? They've sat with it and now they'll bring it up in a bar or they'll bring it up with their family around dinner. And like that's the moment because you have internalized it and learned it with confidence, right? To make it your own and make it your own piece of wisdom or knowledge. And there are insidious ends of that spectrum in terms of propaganda and mis and disinformation, but at the end of the day, I think we need to create more opportunities for people to kind of sit with the long form stuff. And so that's going to be a big challenge, I think, of the current coming years. We won't go down the AI rabbit hole and the information rabbit hole right now, but we can kind of end there. But before we go, I wanted to kind of open the floor, and we've covered a lot today in terms of individual moral responsibility, system level, climate change. When people are kind of thinking about their ethical toolkit in this, what feels like an existential moment, if you could leave our listeners with kind of the one thing to think about, what would that be?
Oh, it's such a good prompt. I think the simple version is just because you can't do everything, that doesn't mean you can't do something.
Great.
And by doing something, you not only, I think, respond to very real moral reasons that are calling you to engage in the world, but I think you're also responding to this threat to your agency. You're
Yep.
like, oh no, I do get to build my life
Yeah.
and live a decent life, even though you've put me into this system that feels like it robs me of so much.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So do something. There's the tagline.
Love it. Okay, that's great. I love ending on that high note. Well, Travis, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.